Welcome to today's Porous Series Portfolio webinar, Understanding the First Step of the Adhesive Selection Process. Why we need to know what's being laminated. Hello, I'm Jim Berzaitis, Marcom Manager for Performance Tapes North America, and I'll be your moderator for today's event. For clarity, the audio lines will be muted during today's presentation. To submit a question, use the chat tool located on your screen. Time permitting, all questions will be answered at the end of the webinar. If your question is not answered during the event, we will contact you directly to provide an answer. Upon registration, you should have received a digital copy of the Porous Series Product Selection Tool. It would be beneficial to have a printed copy of the file handy or the file open for reference during the presentation. If you would like a hard copy of the tool, please contact your account manager. Today's presenters are Avery Dennison Performance Tapes Application Engineer Scott Krusinski and General Industrial Product Manager Deanne Lewis. I will now hand over to Deanne.
Thank you for taking time out of your busy day to join us for our second webinar in this series, Step 1 Lamination. Hopefully by now everyone has been working with the Core Series tool and is finding the program easy to use and making it easier for you and your organization to do business with Avery Dennison. Our goal is to provide a tool to your organization that can help educate your entire team and your customer on the key informational needs that are required to choose the correct adhesive for the application, hopefully resulting in quicker quote turnaround to your customers. The Core Series portfolio is designed to provide a full breadth of adhesive technologies that will cover the majority of your application needs. The Core Series portfolio features 32 products from 9 adhesive families, which you can see are color-coded over to the right-hand side of the screen. The full colored circles represent a particular adhesive technology. Example orange represents the general purpose rubber category. Whereas the 4 products listed at the bottom of the list are differential products, which means they have 2 different adhesives. For example, the first differential product is Fast Tape 8306, which has general purpose rubber on the unwind side and removable adhesive on the liner side. The Core Series portfolio also covers all of the typical pressure-sensitive adhesive constructions. One of the key barriers to quoting quickly based on your feedback has been obtaining pricing. In order to address this, we have instant volume-based pricing that can be obtained from either your account manager or our dedicated application support line or email. 24-hour sampling on our 9-inch by 30-foot samples are available for all Core Series products by visiting our URL, avydn.co/pt-samples. Please use the password tapesample. It's as simple as filling out your name, address, and clicking on the samples you would like to be sent to you. Save it as a favorite for quick accessibility. In addition, you may need wide web samples. Feel free to call or request from your account manager or the application support line. We also have the dedicated application support line and email address for quick assistance in the event that you need some help in determining the Core Series product that you need for your application. All Core Series products have a 1-roll MOQ based on published width and length noted on either page 13 or 14 of your guide. All products have a 4-day lead time. We will also slit all slittable products to 4 inches or above free of charge. You can determine which products are noted with an asterisk or with 2 asterisks next to the product on page 13 or 14 of the guide. In addition, we have recently changed our Core Series product to a 2-year warranty for date of shipment versus 1 year. For all data sheets have also been updated on our website. If anyone has any questions, you can ask at this time. No? Okay? Now it's time to open the hard copy of your selection tool if you have one. If not, you should have received a digital copy when you registered for the webinar. Okay. I'm going to turn it over to Scott. He will lead you through the use of the guide and a few examples to help you become familiar with the guide and how it works.
Thanks, Deanne. So we know the adhesive selection process can be somewhat complex and difficult at times. So our goal with the course series portfolio product selection tool was to simplify that. So we've distilled it down into 4 steps. And in the first webinar of this series, we broadly looked at each step. And now, for this particular episode, we'll be looking at the lamination portion of the 4 simple steps for the application. So, with that, we'll move towards lamination, which is step 1. And really, that's all about identifying what type of material you will be laminating to. Okay? So this could be common materials like foams, fibrous materials, and films and foils. So in the selection tool guide, if you have that with you, you can refer to it. We have a chart here where it charts our adhesive types against the broader categories like foams, fibrous materials, films, and foils. And later on in this webinar, we'll be going through specific materials and how they would interact with different adhesive types. But while we're still here, take a moment to look at the different adhesive types we have available in the course series. So we have a general purpose rubber, we have other rubber materials, we have acrylic adhesives, and then we also have the silicone within that. Okay, so these are the adhesive types, and there are going to be multiple products per adhesive type. So take, for example, our general purpose acrylic, which is one of my favorites from this portfolio. We have it in a transfer tape form. Many of you might know the product FT1126, and then we would also have that in other product constructions like our FBA 8960, which is a double-coated version of that. So I'll take you deeper into the types of materials and how we would recommend laminating them in a second here. So if we move on to the next question, or the next step in the process, this is determining the surface energy of the substrate your laminated part will be bonding to. Okay? So really you have to identify what type of substrate chemistry you're working with, and then through our selection tool you can identify the type of surface energy option that you need to account for. We have 4 different types of surface energy. We have high, medium, low, and extra low. And in our selection tool, you'll see that there is a long list of different materials that you can find what type of surface energy it fits for, and then based off that, you can help select what adhesive would be best for the end-use substrate. So the next question we would be asking in step 3 is what other end-use requirements must our composite survive in? Okay, so you've laminated a tape to a material, you've cut it out, you're now sticking to a substrate, and now we need to figure out, okay, how long does it actually need to stay stuck, and what type of conditions is it going to be exposed to? So one of the first things we need to consider is temperature resistance. Humidity resistance is another important aspect. We have solvent and chemical resistance to consider, UV light. When you see shear, you can often think of that as a load or some kind of curvature that the die-cut part is wrapped around. And we also have in this table for end-use requirement considerations tack, generic or general relative cost of each product. And then, if you're working within an automotive application, there's oftentimes going to be an OEM specification for which your foam and tape need to pass. And that is outside of the course series. If you go to our website or Google Avery Dennison Cert Finder, you'll be able to find our web page where you can select the correct foam, the correct tape, and the correct substrate along with the different OEM specification. And we actually issue certifications for those, which you can download and share with your customer to help facilitate your selling process. Then the final step in how we like to move along in the course series is selecting your tape construction. And there are two aspects to this step. There's understanding the construction. So are you going to be working with a transfer tape or a double-coated tape? And by the way, a transfer tape and double-coated tape would be categorized as a double-sided tape. So that's where you're laminating to a material and you're bonding that laminated material to another substrate. We also have single-coated tape available in the course series as well, where there would be no lamination step because Avery Dennison Performance Tapes has already done that portion for you. So take, for example, our foil tapes in the course series. Those will already be laminated to an aluminum foil. All right, so I will give the next slide to Deanne to cover the course series product portfolio.
Okay, so the product selection process is easy. As you can see, the color coding on the adhesive family follows all the way throughout the selection tool. On page 3, we have all of our general purpose adhesive families, which provide a transfer tape and a double-coated option for each family, followed by the liner option for each construction type. In addition, we provide the ordering information such as the spec number, the MOQ of one roll, the width, the minimum length of the product, and of course the 4-day lead time. In addition, we provide the thickness of each product, breaking it down by the unwind side adhesive, the carrier, the liner side adhesive, the total thickness of the product with and without the liner. Please also note the products marked with 2 asterisks are produced in full adhesive width only due to the aggressive nature of these adhesives. Products marked in blue are approved under Title 21 for indirect food contact, and our HPA 1902 and 1905 are UL recognized. On page 14 of the selection tool are the differential products, our double-coated foams, our single-coated foils, and flocks that are all organized in the same fashion. Okay?
All right, so for today's focus, as we've mentioned before, we're going to be focusing on that first step in the 4-step process, and that's, what are you laminating to? So we're going to go over what type of materials you typically work with and what kind of tapes we recommend for those materials. We took a poll before where we're asking what you thought were the most difficult materials to laminate to that were within the course series portfolio guide. We have some best practices around lamination and Anchorage to share with you. And then we also have some product selector tool examples to take you through. So for the first question again, so what are you laminating to? Again, this is the first step in the process. We set it in this order because that's how it goes throughout the supply chain, right? We send you a tape, you laminate it, it gets die cut out, it gets applied to a substrate, and needs to exist in an end-use environment, okay? So that's how we're working the 4 steps, and this is an important question to ask about what you're laminating to because different adhesive chemistries are compatible with different materials. So the guide is helping you determine that. So within the lamination selection guide, again, we're referring to this chart again. Again, there is the adhesive types on that first column, and again, it's color-coded. And you'll be able to follow that adhesive type throughout the selection guide. When you see a circle that's filled in, that means we're recommending that type of adhesive for that type of material. When it is completely empty circle, that means we would not recommend that particular adhesive type for that particular material. And then when it's halfway filled, that means it could be used. We'd recommend it, but you might have to do some tweaking in your process to making sure you get a good lamination, and it might be specific to within the type of material you're working with. So, getting deeper into the material categories that we have decided to list in the course series. Again, There's the broader category of foams, and within foams we have 3 different categories of urethanes. Urethane is a very popular foam material, and the first one we show is polyether urethane, not to be confused with the next column, which is polyester urethane. I'll walk you through what the difference is between those two and why we actually list that differently and recommend different tapes for that in an example later on. The next category we have is what we're calling dense urethanes. Many of you are familiar with Rogers Poron or maybe some other brands like High Pure Cell or Norseal. Those are much denser closed cell foams that have a skin on it, and those can be quite challenging to bond to actually. The next category we are calling a family of sponge rubber foams. So this would be your EPDMs, PVC, nitrovinyl, and neoprene. And again, the key word in this category is foams, okay? We're not talking about dense rubber extrusions. We're talking about rubber sponge foams, like a crushed EPDM that has a cellular foam-like property to it. Then the last foam category we have on here is silicone sponge foam. And most of you know this, silicone can be very difficult to bond to, and there are sponge versions of this material that are used for gasketing applications. And we have really only one product we recommend for that if you're going to be laminating without a primer, and that's FT9302, which has a silicone adhesive on the one side that can bond to silicone sponge foam materials. Then the next broader category is what we're calling fibrous, and we're lumping it all together here. This would include nonwovens, felts, and fabrics. An example of one of these would be a flock that's used in automotive for buzz, squeak, and rattle. That would fit within the fibrous category. Then the next broader category we have is for films and foils. And you can see here we segment it by high and medium surface energy and then low surface energy. So for you to refer to whether or not what film or foil is which surface energy, you would need to see our surface energy chart, which is the next step of our process in our selection tool. So moving along, we did a quick survey, and Deanne, you had polled them, and what was the first result they had there?
So they said the third most difficult type of material to bond to is dense urethanes. So Scott, can you please discuss why?
Yeah, so I'm not surprised this is in one of the top 3. These dense urethanes definitely can be hard to bond to. They have a skin on them that we find makes it kind of difficult to bond to. And because it's so dense, you have to work with different lamination settings. So not surprised to see it in the top 3 there. We definitely have products that work well for it, though, and as long as you match it up with the right product and the right lamination settings, you should be fine.
Okay. Thank you, Scott. The participants indicated that the silicone sponge rubber is the second most difficult substrate to laminate to. Why is that?
Yeah, so I was surprised this wasn't number 1, but it does fit up in the top 3. Silicone sponge foam, as I was mentioning before, silicone is a very low surface energy material, and the only adhesive products that we would recommend for bonding to silicone sponge foams are silicone adhesives. That, or you would have to use a primer to laminate with an acrylic. So I'm not surprised to see that at number 2.
Thank you, Scott. So our customers indicate that sponge rubber foams are the absolute most difficult to bond to. Why is that?
Well, Deanne, I'll be honest, I was surprised to see this one at number 1, actually. So EPDM, nitrovinyl, and neoprene are a rubbery type of foam, and they're used primarily for water sealing. And I can tell you that rubber in general is hard to bond to, especially the denser extruded types like weather stripping or mats. But the rubber foams are usually a little easier to bond to. And again, that just goes with saying that if you select the right tape with the right lamination settings, it actually should be no problem at all.
Thank you, Scott.
Okay, so next up I'll be taking you guys through what we recommended for best practices for lamination settings and Anchorage checking. again, many of you are converters, and you've been doing lamination for years. But we've all been through these situations where you laminate a tape and you try to pull off the liner, and the adhesive comes with it and it didn't stick to the material at all. So we just have some best practices that we like to share. These are publicly available type of situations here. So the first one we have for lamination settings, best practices are, we like to recommend heating the tape up before it's being laminated, and that's with an inline heating drum on your laminator. Whenever you're able to heat up the tape, you're going to soften the adhesive a little bit, which means it's going to flow more. And when it's in a more softer, flowy state, by the time it gets nipped at the nip roller to the laminated material, because it's softer, it can really dig into the crevices and get some good mechanical interlocking. And that is especially the case on porous foams or open cell foams that have been cut, or non-skin foams. But that is even the case with skin foams as well. When you really get that adhesive to flow, you're really making a good intimate contact with the surface, and when the adhesive cools down, it has a really good grip. So we have different temperatures we recommend for different products, and believe it or not, the temperature recommendation is more based on the liner type that you have with your product. So if you're using a craft liner or a polyester liner on a tape product, we recommend that you generally use 225 degrees Fahrenheit. Could that change for different foam types? Yes, it could. But with those liner types, you're able to get to those types of temperatures, and we find that at 225 degrees Fahrenheit, your adhesive is softening enough to get a pretty good lamination. And then we do have to change the recommendation, though, for poly-coated craft liners and 12-point board liners. Those liners have a polyethylene coating on them, which makes them moisture resistant. However, it does mean that that polyethylene can melt at temperatures of around 225 degrees. So if you've ever tried to laminate those type of liners before at higher temperatures, especially if you're moving slower, you might blister the liner. So we recommend 200 degrees Fahrenheit for those types of liners. Then the next step that we like to recommend for gap thicknesses, we like to divide it into 3 different categories. So first up, we have the softer foams. These are foams you can grab with your hand. You can kind of squeeze and compress a fairly good amount. And for those types of foams, we recommend that you compress it by about 35%. Okay, some of the examples of the foam types would be like open cell polyurethanes, EPDMs, or nitrovinyls. And the math on that we're giving as an example below. So if you have a 2-inch thick foam and you need to compress it by 35%, you multiply that 2-inch by 100 minus 35%, and the math comes out to 1.3 inches for your gap setting. So moving on to dense foams and felts, we recommend that you use about 15% compression. Many of you have worked with Rogers pour-on foam before, and you know how it's harder to squeeze. And you don't want to over-compress this type of material in your lamination, or the tape could get wonky, I think is the technical term. You might get over-compressed and get wrinkles and stuff like that. So we're recommending 15% for that. And the math on that is if you have a 2-inch thick Rogers pour-on foam and you want to compress it by 15%, that means it would be about a 1.7-inch gap. Then for films and foils, we just recommend you go 100% with compression, so basically no gap at all. The way the tape and the foil will work, you won't get wrinkles at 100%, and it should laminate totally fine. So the next best practice that we'd like to take you through is checking the anchorage of the tape to the material you've laminated to. And this example is more set towards foam. Once the tape has been laminated to a foam, you can cut out a section of it. You would remove the liner, and you can apply it back or fold it onto itself so that the PSA is bonding with the PSA, okay, as shown in the picture on the right there. And then the next step, as you're folding it together, you want to squeeze together with your fists and apply some firm pressure Give it a few seconds, and then you want to reach down with your thumbs on the side of the foam and pull it apart at the fold. So at that point, you're either going to have a few things happen. So if the foam tears, that means you have a great bond, and that would be typical of transfer tapes. If you have a double-coated tape, that might prevent the foam from really tearing. Now that being said, if you have a tape that pulls apart, but it still remains laminated to the foam, that means you have a pretty good bond still. Now on the flip side, if you have a tape that is easily delaminating from one side when you pull it apart, that means you have a poor bond. And you have a really, really bad bond, by the way, if you're removing the liner and the tape comes with the liner and it doesn't remain adhered to the foam. We've all been there. It happens. All right, so next I will take you through some examples of how to select the correct tape for different types of materials that you might be laminating to. So the first one up we have is an EPDM foam. So again, if you go to the Lamination Selection Guide and you see that EPDM foam fits under the broader category of sponge rubber foams, you can pull your finger down that column and you can match it up with different adhesive types that we would recommend. So for example, the general purpose rubber we would recommend. A few products within the general purpose rubber category would be FBR 1950 or FBR 8950. But then you'll see in the next adhesive category, the high shear general purpose rubber we would not recommend. And if you keep continuing, you see that we have some acrylics that we definitely recommend for it. For example, the general purpose acrylic, again, one of my favorite categories with the FT 1126 or the 8960 would bond very well to sponge rubber foams. So you would have to keep that in mind as you're working with these types of foams. Example 2. I want to talk to you about the differences between polyester foam and polyether foam. And again, you might see some acronyms that might not match up with what you're used to seeing with the core series. So, you know, if you're looking through the guide and you see, oh, I'm working with a PET foam, and some of you might not know what PET is, you can easily Google it and find out that PET is the acronym for polyester, and that's polyester urethane. If you see PEU, that's a polyether urethane. Okay, and then if you see just PU, that's the broader category of polyurethane foam. So in that case, you'll want to assume that it's a polyether urethane, because if you move down those columns, you'll see that the polyether urethane foam, which is the first one, for the first column, has less products that are recommended for it versus the polyester urethane. Overall, the polyester urethane is pretty easy to bond to, but the polyether urethanes can be a little more difficult to bond to. And that's largely because of how the foams are manufactured. There's this like a processing oil that makes it a little harder for adhesives to grip to that polyether type of foam. And the final example we have today for you is a film example. So you're working with a Kapton film, and you look at your lamination selection guide and you see that films and foils, it tells you to refer to the surface energy chart to determine whether or not it's a high or low surface energy film. So we would move on to the next step, which we're presenting on in the next webinar, and you look through the different types of materials that would be listed there, and you see that there's a polyimide with Kapton in parentheses. And many of you might know this already, but Kapton is DuPont's brand name for polyimide films. And in the surface energy selection chart, you determine that it is a high surface energy material. So you can go back to the lamination selection guide and go down along the high surface energy column, and you can see that pretty much every tape kind of bonds to Kapton. For high surface energy films, it's pretty easy for most tapes to bond to them. So your selection process for which tape you would use with Kapton film would be pretty wide open, depending on what substrate you're going to bond to and the end use requirements. So the next thing we're going to discuss real quick here is a tip we have, and we have two tips to discuss. So we want you to be aware of stretchy foams. This is an important thing to consider, what you're going to be laminating with, and you have to consider step 4, what tape construction you're going to be picking. So if you laminate a transfer tape to a very, very stretchy tape, and maybe if you're a converter and you're selling this die cut to an automotive tier, and this tier company is applying the die cut by hand, a lot of times when laborers are applying die cuts by hand, they stretch out the tape a little too far when they're applying it to the substrate. And that can actually be a bad thing, because if you've stretched out the die cut on the substrate, you're going to build in some internal stress on the foam. It's going to want to fight back against the adhesive. And eventually that could mean that the die cut could delaminate from the end-use substrate. So in order to avoid that, we would recommend a double-coated tape. Okay, so a double-coated tape is going to have a carrier, like a polyester film or a tissue, that won't overly stretch out when being applied by hand to a substrate. And then you won't have that internal stress to deal with, and then you're less likely to have delamination. All right, the next tip we have is to be aware of very porous foams. All right, and it's very similar to the last step we just discussed, except in this situation, porous foams can basically suck up too much transfer tape. So if you laminate a transfer tape to a very porous foam, especially if you apply a lot of pressure to it, the adhesive will actually get sucked up into the foam, and not enough adhesive coat weight will be exposed on the outer layer of the foam. So in that situation, if you have a poor coat weight of adhesive where you're needing to bond the substrate, you might not have enough adhesive to really adhere to the substrate. So for that example, we would recommend that you would work with a double-coated tape as well. In that situation, the carrier would prevent the tape from overly laminating within the foam, and it creates a barrier so that there's a nice clean coat weight on the substrate side of the tape. And with that, I'll hand it over to Deanne.
Okay, so a summary of step 1 is, of course, understanding the correct adhesive chemistry for the tape construction, and making material and adhesive combination work correctly. Making sure we have compatibility and performance in the construction is all about the right tape for the right type of materials. Foams, fibrous materials, and films and foils all have different adhesive chemistries. The lamination selection guide will help you identify the correct adhesive for the substrate. And having the correct information about the materials that you'll be laminating to is, of course, essential for making the correct adhesive match. So our goal at Avery Dennison Performance Tape is to make sure that the portfolio is best in class, and it will continue to evolve and be refined to better meet our customer needs. We would love your feedback as to ways we can improve. We'll continue to send communication of updates and enhancements to the program to your email address, so we'll be hoping that you all provide us feedback. So our next webinar will be on June 11th at 2 o'clock. It will cover the second step of the process, adhesive selection. Hopefully everybody has found the session to be informative and even hopefully learned a new trick or two based on Scott's tips. So we are going to go through, I believe, the questions that came up during the webinar. Scott's going to answer some of those for you, and then feel free to ask any additional questions that you may not have asked via chatter.
Thanks, Deanne. Thanks for the questions that came in during the presentation. Much appreciated, and we'll get to those right now. First question, how to reduce wrinkles caused during lamination? I guess basically, do you reduce the air pockets in between release liner and laminated substrate?
I like this question. This is something I had to troubleshoot quite a bit with converters. One of the best ways to reduce air pockets that might occur between the tape and the laminated substrate is to really ensure that you have a good angle of difference between the material that's being laminated and the tape. So in the best scenario, the tape is coming around the nip roller, and the lamination material is coming in straight. If you have that angle as a lower angle, sometimes the tape can come into contact with the lamination material and it can get prematurely laminated, and that can mean a air pocket can get stuck in there and then it gets laminated in. So that would be the best way to reduce that. In another situation, you're just not going to see air pockets really if you're working with a very porous material. So that would be less important for an open cell foam.
Thanks, Scott. Another question that came in. Poron has a ink coating on it. Is adhesive bonding to the urethane skin or the actual ink/release agent applied to it?
Yeah, so I suppose I've seen some of those situations before. Tapes are going to bond to whatever material they're coming in contact with. Sometimes the adhesive can penetrate porous surfaces, but just like paint on a wall, on drywall, you're not going to be bonding to drywall, you're bonding to paint. So if there's some type of ink or coating on the foam, you need to understand that and work with us to really make a good recommendation. That being said, for Rogers Poron foams, it has like a skin sometimes with a colored skin. The tape is bonding to that, but the products we recommend are usually well to bond to it.
So next question, this one's for Deanne. What do we do if the material we're laminating to is not in the selection tool?
So in that case, what would happen is you could call your account manager or also our application support line or send in an email.
All right, thank you.
Welcome.
What primers do you recommend for silicone bonding in your adhesive?
Well, that's a very case-by-case basis, Jim, and whenever you guys encounter that kind of situation, that's where we would also recommend that you reach out to our technical support line. We'd have to know a little bit more about the specific types of silicone material you're going to laminate to, but then also the specifics of the tape you want to work with, because you got to match it up. So that's how we would go about that situation.
All right, thank you, Scott. And the next question we have, how do you recommend optimizing lamination settings?
Okay, so we always recommend starting with the best practices that we went over in the webinar. And that being said, there's always room for optimization. So you really have three controls for lamination. You have heat, you have the amount of pressure you're using to laminate to, and then you also have the speed at which you're laminating to. So, I always want to recommend that you start at 225 degrees Fahrenheit or 200 degrees Fahrenheit, depending on the liner you have. And then based off the type of foam you have, you can always improve your bond to the material by increasing the pressure that you're working with up until a certain point to where you might be getting some bad wrinkles. So you might be at 35% compression, and you might be learning that, 40% is better, and we tried 50%, but 50% was really too much, and we were getting too much stress and wrinkles in the liner, so you back it off there. And then the same goes for speed. We usually recommend that you're starting somewhere around 30 feet per minute. And obviously, if you want to be more efficient in your process, you're going to up that as much as you can. I would recommend doing that and finding out what your tolerance is for how well the lamination goes at what speed. And between those three levers, you're really optimizing on a case-by-case basis based off the foam and the tape you're working with for those three settings.
All right, thanks, Scott. So during the presentation, we were referencing the product selection tool for the core series. If you do not have a hard copy, I would highly recommend you contact your account manager and have that person order them for your staff or for yourself. It's a lot easier to use in the hard copy format. There's a folding mechanism in there that helps you navigate a little easier than electronic. Then really quickly, I'll leave this up on the screen for a moment. This is Scott and Deanne's contact information. You could reach them out to them directly or contact your Avery Dennison representative, and they could arrange a call or a possible visit with either Scott or Deanne. So once again, thank you for attending. Later today, you will receive a post-event email, and in that email will be a feature story penned by Deanne and Scott called Selecting the Right Adhesive for Your Application, What Material is Being Laminated, and a short survey. We truly value your feedback, so please answer the questions so we can continue to improve the course series and these presentations. If you'd like a copy of today's presentation, please reach out once again to your account manager. They'll be able to share that with you. And as a reminder, Deanne mentioned earlier, our next course series webinar will take place on June 11th and focus on Step 2, the adhesive selection process, determining the surface energy of the substrate your laminated part will be bonded to. I think we should probably work on a shorter name by next June 11th, and we could try to do that. We look forward to you joining us in June, and we thank you again, and have a good day.